Hello and welcome to Oracle License Training. My name's Jane McCulloch and I'm from Medora Consulting, and our intention is to help you through the minefield that is Oracle licensing. What we're going to cover in Module 1 is basically a bit of an introduction, what Oracle licensing is all about, what some of the history of it is, and what the basics are. So this module really is just the starting point, the basics, some of the old metrics and so on. Everybody thinks that Oracle's complicated, and in some respects it is, but why is it complicated? Mostly it's around some of the older stuff that you've bought, when you bought it, how long ago you bought it, and the fact that you've bought it perhaps piecemeal over a period of time. Current licensing is basically quite straightforward, and we will go through that, and that really is a straightforward way of looking at licensing from either the server point of view or the users. Where it becomes complicated is old contracts, old Oracle license and service agreements, perhaps some of the different ways you've ordered and purchased over the years. There have been lots of changes. The terms and conditions have been changed. Everything's altered quite regularly by Oracle, and some of the terms and conditions aren't always very clear. We do a lot these days with virtualization, consolidation and so on, and that adds a level of complexity. There's lots and lots of different Oracle products now. They've bought lots of companies, they've added lots of modules to their portfolio. The acquisitions have been acquisitions with different license models, different license metrics, different ways of doing it. So all of that adds a lot of complexity. And if you like, Oracle's sales culture is typically fairly short term. They are quite aggressively targeted, so we'll quite aggressively look at selling on a quarterly basis. We just talked about how complicated Oracle is, and one of the reasons why it's complicated is because the metrics have changed over time. So if you've been an Oracle user for a long period of time, you might have some very old metrics like concurrent devices, you might have a mixture of those and the new ones which are processors and named user plus, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about those over the period of time of this course. So back in pre-1999, in the old days of before the internet really got going, we had concurrent devices, and that was all based on how many people were logged into the system at any one time. So we just counted up who was logged in. It didn't matter whether they were authorized to use the system or what they were doing when they weren't logged in. It was purely on when the person was logged in, and we counted up how many people had actually logged in. And we used to get spikes in the morning and spikes at lunchtime and perhaps spikes at month end. And what Oracle would do when it was perhaps auditing would be to count the spikes. So what's the maximum number of people that were logged in at any one time? And that's how you worked out your concurrent devices, and that's how you decided how many were needed. Around the late 90s, the internet was much more popular. People were starting to use systems in more of a client-server mode. And Oracle decided it would be better if they could either count the users who were authorized to use the system or count the size of the system. So they came up with these new metrics that replaced concurrent devices. However, people who had already got concurrent devices, because they're perpetual licenses, would still have had those in place. So Oracle now brings out power units. And they did start off with power unit Intel and power unit RISC, and then decided that was too complicated, so combined them all together and came up with universal power units. And it's rather a messy or complicated way of calculating them, which to do with the speed of the box, but we won't go into that detail at the moment. And we also had a named user at the time, and that is anybody who's authorized to use the system. Doesn't matter whether they're logging in or not, so quite a bit different from the concurrent devices or concurrent user metrics. Named users is all about who's been authorized to use the system. So we count everybody who's been given a login. So we now have a model where it's based on the size of the box. So if you can't count the users, you have to work out the speed of the box and work out how many of these universal power units you need. Alternatively, how many people you're going to have logged in, how many people are you going to have authorized to use the system, and everybody gets a named user. So that's how you buy your licenses. And there's a minimum that you have to have of named users, and you use your calculation of universal power units first to work that out. Beginning of 2001, Oracle had decided that that was too complicated. Processors were getting faster, people needed a lot more UPUs, everybody was complaining about that. So they came up with a new metric called processor, and a definition of what was a processor. And at the same time, instead of this power units divided by 30, it was purely 10 named users per processor. So we've still got a named user, it's still everybody who's authorized to use the system. We've now got a processor metric, so we calculate how many processors are in the server. In 2002, they tweaked it slightly and came up with a named user plus, and there are some extra features and functionality within a named user plus that were added in. Processors stayed the same, and the minimums were then calculated at 25 per processor for Database Enterprise Edition. Standard Edition is different, and we will talk about why that's different and how we work it out, but the minimums for Standard Edition is only 5, and it's a total of 5. It's not 5 per processor, it's not 5 per server, it's 5 in total for you as a customer. Application Server and some of the other middleware products are based on 10 per processor, not 25.